Hello, Oliver. Hello, Paul. It's very nice to have you both on my podcast today.
It's great to be here. Fantastic. Thanks for having us.
One of the first times I'm doing few people in the shot at the same time, and it's really I'm expecting this to be really exciting. You both are the members of the Conservative Party, but I find the career path of Paul particularly interesting because you have switched from Labour Party, who you have been a member for most of your life now,
Correct.
and then you switched to the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
Uh, how does your experience inside of the Labour Party compare to the experience inside of the Conservative team?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting journey, I have to say, because over the past 4 months since I left the Labour Party, I've had a fantastic experience with my new colleagues because, if truth be told, my views were aligning far more, had always, in fact, been far more aligned with many of my present colleagues than my past colleagues. And so, actually, it's been far more comfortable a journey than even I could have imagined.
Ah, so do you share that same view about the Conservative Party?
For me, my journey to Conservative Party has been a bit different from Paul's.
No, yeah, of course.
When I was sort of a teenager, perhaps, I was in that sort of floating voter type area. And then I think as you get a bit older and you see how the world works, I think that natural pivot to the right happens. And so for me, it was more from the centre ground to the right for me. But I found the Conservative Party a very friendly place. I think it's nice to be amongst friends who have the same idea about how the world works and how to improve it. So yeah, I very much agree that it's a good place to be, and yeah, I'm glad to have Paul in the same side.
One of the things I wanted to ask you in particular is why would you switch from the place that I would assume you're comfortable, were comfortable inside of the party you were most of the time in. Why would you switch to the Conservative Party? Is that a sign that your beliefs changed, or is that maybe something else?
No, I think it's a realization that actually the things that had always made me uncomfortable within the Labour Party were actually the Labour Party's default setting. They weren't the exception to the norm, they were the norm. You know, when I became a member of the Labour Party, Tony Blair was Prime Minister, everybody else was leaving the Labour Party. I was the only one joining just after the invasion of Iraq. And I should have realized then, perhaps, that many of the people who had left and were eventually going to come back didn't agree with me on much. And I'm afraid I stuck to it during the Corbyn years because I wanted to get rid of the Corbynites, because I think they were deeply damaging for not just the party, but for the country. I've realized over time that default setting is more representative of the period 2015 to 2019 than it is, say, 97 to 2001. And just as an example, one of the things that were triggered was 18 months ago during the Israel-Gaza debate, when there was a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir. You might know them, Vladimir.
I've never heard about them.
They're an organization who were not previously prescribed by law as a terrorist organization, but are now. And at the time, they were making all sorts of statements in protests in London, so it's a local issue, about the need for jihad on the streets of London. I happened, perhaps unsurprisingly, to take issue with this, wrote about it online, and got a call from within the local Labour Party saying, Councillor Fisher, we don't think you fully appreciate the charitable nature of this organisation. And some of our members within the group don't think you appreciate the charitable nature of this organisation. Now, Rishi Sunak's government then, a couple of months later, prescribed them as a terrorist organisation. So I was vindicated, and I was right to stand up against it. And the fact that there was an attempt to silence what I was saying online, I think, is deeply indicative, I'm afraid, of the electoral incentives that the Labour Party has in London and across the country.
Just to be clear, your move to the Conservative Party has happened at one of the most probably inconvenient moments when it could have happened. So is it probably indicative of the fact that you really stuck to your beliefs and you really wanted a fair change to the country?
I mean, it's kind of you to raise this, Vladimir. I think I would, of course, say that is right. Regardless of what people think, the reality is the Conservative Party seems to me stands up for the things that I stand up for, which is on foreign policy, supportive of our allies on local policy and national policy, trying to be fiscal conservatives. There aren't many of those around nowadays. The Labour Party talks a good talk, but it's clearly not walking the walk. And so the Conservative Party is the only and the right home for me in this country. So that's why I joined.
Oliver, haven't heard some of his opinions about, not opinions, but facts about how the Labour Party functions and the reasons why he left. Does that really correspond? Is that the way you imagined Labour Party was like, or your imagination of the general structure was different?
Yeah. So just for the viewers, Paul and I have actually been friends for a long time. So we're both from Cardiff, and so I've been hearing about sort of machinations within the Labour Party for many years. So I can completely sort of agree with everything Paul's just said then. I have a few other friends who sort of have affiliations with the Labour Party, and yes, I gather there is a sort of certain sect from the Labour Party that have taken sort of large parts of control over it, and they are moving the country in a direction that is quite far removed from that Blairite sort of New Labour, sort of more centre ground, which I think people and some of those swing voters had felt more comfortable with. I think the idea now that sort of Paul's gone on board with, which I was trying to persuade him for many years, and so I'm glad he's come around. And I think for me, the idea of the Conservative Party is all about sort of low tax, low crime, low immigration, better growth, better education, better infrastructure. And that's what the Conservative Party for me is. And I think if that's what Conservative Party still stands for, whilst the Labour Party seem to be going down that opposite route of heavy government, heavy taxation, supporting lots of different groups with various sort of ethical grounds. And yeah, it's not something, it's not a party I don't want to be part of. So yeah, I think that even as the difficult times of the Conservative Party at the moment, I think that it's still the right way forward.
And I'm going to be honest with you both. One of the things that excites me about having you on the podcast is because I've interviewed some people who were the faces of the Conservative Party before and remain the faces, and they get a lot of criticism because many people say the party has experienced a lot of problems, a lot of change, has lost due to those problems. But you both are the new faces within the party. So what do you think you should do to really, and what you are doing to really gain the trust of people right now from the start?
It's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing you have to do, and I think that's what the party is trying to do, is recognize that everything didn't go perhaps as smoothly over the last 15 years as we hoped. I think when we look back at it and when sort of historians reflect on this time, obviously there was Brexit, there was a recovery initially from the credit crisis, and then obviously COVID. So I think in some ways it was very hard for us to build the momentum to get the things we really wanted to do. I think we became a bit reactive to the circumstances.
So the crisis was building upon crisis, and it was making it harder for the government to succeed.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's good to remember that, but obviously that can come across as just listing excuses about why we didn't do the things perhaps we wanted to do. So I think it's about acknowledging that and then sort of advising people, actually, there's new faces, there's new ideas, times have moved on since 2010. And I think it's all about sort of creating a new set of goals, a new set of agendas, but based on those inherent conservative values and trying to sort of find a way of phrasing it, perhaps sort of conserving all the things that make good government going forward rather than harking on to some past ideas.
So what are some of the main problems that you would say the government right now should solve, like urgently? Your ideal government.
There are two points here, it seems to me. The first is about meeting the British electorate where they're at. And I think the electorate has changed radically since Brexit. Oliver's absolutely right to mention immigration. The British public want action on immigration, both legal and, of course, illegal. And any Conservative government that's going to take power in the future will need solid commitments on both of those fronts. And I think it's absolutely right that the leadership is looking at reviewing our international treaty obligations and about how we facilitate that kind of action. The second thing, though, is less populist than reform will ever be able to deliver, and it's actually treating the British public like grown-ups. Like, interestingly enough, the Conservative Party was doing in 2010. when it was talking about the sizable levels of debt that we've incurred as a country. Our biggest problem as a country right now is our addiction to debt, much like Western Europe and America. And our biggest challenge is both cutting down our budget deficits and therefore spending less every month, every year on interest payments. Because in December of last year alone, we spent £8 billion on our interest. We're spending more on servicing our debt than we are on things like, for example, education. And that's not sustainable. And I think these twin problems need to be front and center of any future campaign.
Yeah. So you mentioned reform right there. It's really important that we address this now. I think reform has been trying to portray themselves as this patriotic, standing up for values, really sticking up to beliefs, British values, the fact that they're saying they're fading away and they will get them back in a dramatic fight. But actually, over time, what the Conservatives stood for is lowering taxes, enabling business, allowing people and country to grow, allowing people to have their income. So why do you think that change happened in people's minds, that they now believe reform are standing for these values and not the Conservatives?
I mean, I'm sure Oliver has views on this as well, but the reality is that the British public get the voting choice right every single time. Nobody's in a position to tell the British public they're wrong. And when a political party says to the British public you're wrong, they're going down the wrong route. So I think it's really encouraging that the leadership has accepted in the last 14 years there were some things that went wrong. The next step, though, is recognising that the answers are not towards reform. And the problem with the British public at the moment, the British public is finding that they're being disappointed time and time again. I mean, you look at this government, for example, came in on this message of change, came in largely because of the collapse in the Conservative vote that went in large part to reform. But it's deeply disappointing. And even for Labour voters, this government is failing on almost every single measure of success. And I think that level of disappointment makes the public feel so soon after a landslide win that we're all the same. And our challenge is to convince them that we're not, because it's just not true.
Yeah, I would definitely echo a lot of those sentiments. And I think quite bizarrely, actually, this Labour government, when they first came in, I actually had almost a little bit of ray of hope that they would do some of the things that the Conservative government were going to do, sort of rationalising the way to field payments, for example. And I think that was actually a really interesting example for the Labour Party, where they came in, they recognised that there is an issue with public debt, and giving away free money is not an answer to it, especially when it's given to people who are multimillionaires and there's no rationing in no sense. Obviously, you want to be compassionate to people who need it. But then the Labour Party tried to do perhaps a more sensible thing, which would have had the support of many Conservatives, ended up going back to its backbenchers and going back to the sort of hard left, and then sort of U-turning on that. And I think that's an example of the fact that the Labour Party, there are some sensible elements there, but they are held into the more extreme left. And I think that's something which the Conservative Party is more home with. It's more home with its natural voters. I think we need to move back to that area whilst we've been shifting to the middle ground and almost going to some very almost centre-left policies over the last few years. But I think we had to with COVID and sort of furlough payments and things like that. But I think that perhaps giving lots of money away during COVID perhaps gave the impression that we weren't as fiscally responsible as we had traditionally been. And that gave the electorate a slightly different impression, I think, of the last election.
One of the most important things for me or for anybody for that matter who lives or comes in the country of the UK is how things are going to be going in London, because London is the major city for the UK in general, for its growth, and it's really important what's happening in London. And London is currently being governed by Sadiq Khan, who is I got to know some of the perspectives of people that work in the London Assembly when I went there to interview them. But I would like to hear your perspectives. You, if I'm right to assume, you're famous for criticizing the mayor. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, look, this mayor is an astonishingly arrogant individual who finds it very difficult to listen to other opinions, both outside of and within his own political party. I've yet to meet many people in the Labour Party who speak privately well of Sadiq Khan, because he now has his own personal fiefdom, which he largely runs according to his own whim. And we can see only this week he's decided to go on the jolly to the African continent in order to, as he says, drum up business. I haven't heard much of him talking about business actually online. But there's all sorts of issues. So what's the biggest issue that you'd expect a mayor of London to deal with in London? It's crime. You look at crime over the past year alone. Shoplifting is now 5 times the national average. Theft of the person's increased by 20% in the space of 12 months. And yet this is a mayor that can't stop talking about decriminalising cannabis. Now,
I've heard that debate, actually.
And we can have that debate, and I know there are people in both parties who might actually agree with that. I happen not to, because I don't think it's time for us to be decriminalising anything. I think, if anything, our laws should be sending a clear message that we're getting tough on crime, and not just the causes of crime. It's getting tough on crime that's now the problem. And I think Sadiq's biggest problem is his failure to prioritise. Now, of course, I've criticised him on other things as well. My patch is the West End. He talks a lot about pedestrianism. Oxford Street, I think, is a bad deal for businesses and for people in the West End. But fundamentally, this is a mayor with the wrong priorities, and he's been in office for too long, and it's time for a fresh face.
Well, you were able to see the party, the Labour Party, from the inside. But what's your impression of the mayor from the outside, as you are entering, I can say entering into politics of the Conservative Party?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I would completely agree with everything Paul said there. And my approach to Sadiq Khan is I've never been a fan of him from the very, very start. I think he's always played his audiences very well, but really not looked after the best interests of London. And just from my own personal experience in the last 13 years since I moved to London, I remember London being safe. I could walk around. Now, if I feel like I walk around Oxford Street with my phone out, I'm always looking for someone.
Kind of holding your phone in your pocket.
Yeah, always checking. I'm worried some moped drivers going to grab it out.
It's better to wear jeans, because jeans kind of cover your pockets. You know, it's kind of tips.
Yeah. You'd hope you'd notice if someone's got your hands in there, yeah.
This shouldn't even be the conversation at the first place. What you should wear, how you should cover it up, whether you should hold your purse to your body when you're traveling in London. It shouldn't even be the conversation.
I think what was fascinating for me, I mean, I'm wearing short sleeves, I'm incredibly hot, so it's very sweating on camera here. But I was over in Singapore recently, and I went to Australia to look at the shows to go out there, and seeing how clean Sydney was, seeing how clean Singapore was, how safe it was. I think, when you stay in the London bubble a bit too long, you get used to you think, oh, it's still a bit of grime, it's a bit of edgy, cool city vibes. Then you realize actually that's morphing into just low-level crime going uncontrolled. And it's that broken glass theory where you let a little bit go, then it becomes more acceptable. And I think that's the thing, perhaps Sadiq Khan. He's sort of got used to the idea that crime is not a problem, and he sort of travels around and everything's calm with all the security guards. So I don't think he's feeling the security issues that everybody else is feeling. I think that's perhaps really out of touch, I'd say, with the local Londoners.
In this way, I think he's finding it hard, and the people are finding it hard to relate to him, to understand him, because as somebody is traveling in cars with security, it is hard to understand the problems of the people who are shouting about crime or shouting about other types of crimes, and I think in that regard, it poses a question: whether the policies that he is doing, whether the actions towards London are genuinely indicative of his incompetence, or is that, or does he realize that he's doing something wrong, but he doesn't know or doesn't want to change it? So is that incompetence, or something that he's doing on purpose?
It'd be nice to give you a neat answer and say it's either one. I think it's probably a combination of both, if I'm being honest. I think perhaps he doesn't have many great ideas about how to fix it, especially since he does sort of quite counterintuitive things, saying nobody should use the tube during COVID and then complaining that TfL's run out of money. And well, you can't have it both ways. It doesn't really make sense. And then also his relationship with government. It was very easy for him with the Conservative government to blame everything that was going wrong with the Conservatives. And now, Paul wants to know more about it, but the dynamic between him and the Labour government now, he's still trying to play sort of internal politics to deflect from his own sort of failings in some ways. But I think it's probably a combination of being out of touch. And he has been in power for quite a long time now, so perhaps that's inevitable. But I think also he doesn't have the best ideas. But I'm not sure Paul would say.
I think there is a complacency there. I agree with Oliver. And essentially, what any future mayor of London needs to be looking at is sending the right messaging from day one. Sadiq's already lost, I'm afraid. He's lost his battle because he's never concentrated on it. But take Kiev as a good example, right? Soon after the revolution in 2014, if you met police officers in 2015, you'd see these new, young, attractive officers who were put on the streets, and you'll remember the news about this, perhaps. I don't know whether you will, Vladimir, but it was all the rage.
They were quite young. They were trying very well.
They were training young and attractive police officers to come into the force, and you'd see very young officers on the beat. I've got a photograph with them somewhere on my Instagram, who were out in force on the streets of Kiev, ready to tackle crime. And the messaging was more important than actually what was happening on the ground in a way, because it was sending a message that something new had happened on the streets of Kiev. And a similar example might be New York, a number of decades ago when the mayor appointed a policing czar. I don't particularly like the use of the word czar, but something like that would be important. And that's what Paul Schroeder as well in the Westminster Council is talking about, in Westminster, appointing a specific enforcement cabinet officer to deal with these issues. Messaging is so important, and I'm afraid Sadiq's just lost the opportunity to drive those messages home.
And you mentioned crime. You mentioned how Sadiq Khan has been ineffective in dealing with crime, tackling crimes. As a young person, many of the young people who managed to listen up to 30 minutes of our podcast now, they are probably asking, yes, it's great. We feel that there are problems with crime. What is the answer? What is he doing wrong, and what could have been done better?
I think to me, it's touching on Paul's tour reference to New York there. Back when Rudy Giuliani, who obviously has now got his own difficulties, but perhaps 20, 25 years ago, when he was perhaps a bit more sort of sensible, let's say, he brought in the 3 strikes policy in New York, sort of zero tolerance, as they referenced it. And it meant that any sort of crime, whether it's littering, whether it's small level sort of apple theft or something like that, 3 strikes, and I think it was an immediate imprisonment for a few months. And in some ways it sounds very harsh, and you think there's going to be a lot of sort of younger offenders who are sort of caught in this sort of awkward gap, like sort of mix. But I think ultimately, if you do it for long enough, it sends a message, and that is that no crime is acceptable. And even just on the way here now, I saw someone wheeling their bike with one wheel missing, and we know exactly what happened there. And that happens all the time. So I would be inclined to try and do a 3 strikes, zero tolerance approach. No matter how low level it is, that's it. So I think that would be just something that would be really interesting, trial, debate, have a conversation about. But I'm sure Paul has some more ideas.
I think there's a really good idea. And I think obviously this is entirely top down. So the mayor should make it absolutely clear that crime is the #1 priority above all else, because without tackling that issue, you can't get everything else right. And another thing that you might want to look at, given that we know that resourcing is still on the ground, is working with businesses to get more security on the ground. So we see security, for example, the West End is provided by the BIDS, Business Investment District, and we can do more of that, it seems to me, if the mayor is committed to working with businesses in this area.
But I hear a lot, yet I hear a lot of people criticizing the Conservatives for what is happening in London and what needs to be understood, even in the London Assembly. Even people who are working in the London Assembly from the Conservative Party, they do not actually hold the major deciding roles. The major deciding role is mayors. So what has been happening in London is due to what mayor has been doing. This is what many people don't understand.
I think there's a perfectly valid argument to be made about trickle down, which is, and we see it exaggerated, I'm afraid, both in London and where myself and Oliver are from in Wales by the Senate, constantly complaining about what the central government did under the Conservative Party, but never taking responsibility for their own actions. And I think that's a real problem here. But we also need to learn as a party that if we're going to come into office at some point in the future with a fiscally conservative message, we're also going to have to ring fence those things that we think are priorities. And law and order and policing has to be one of them. We might have a debate about defence as well. We cannot keep funding everything at the rate that we are presently. So what are we going to ring fence? And I think policing has to be an obvious, in fact, the first candidate.
One of the types of policing that I have only discovered, remember, I'm sorry, friend, I've only discovered this when I came here, started studying here, and I was told about stop and search. It was quite interesting to me. If I'm not mistaken, we don't have that in Ukraine, don't have that in many countries. So I'm interested to get your both perspective on stop and search.
I think it's obviously it's a difficult one in ways, because if you stop and search and you profile the demographics of people who have sort of tendency to have committed more crime, then it's gonna hear that the prejudices within the police force and that therefore it has institutional problems, and that's an issue that gets sort of blown out on the media, and it makes it very difficult for the police to then sort of do their job in many ways. If you take away all stop and search, then people can carry concealed weapons, concealed knives, have almost a free charter to do anything, knowing that there's complete impunity to doing it. So I think it's about having it, but implementing it very precisely in a way that is not perceived to be prejudicial and is actually just based on pure stats, pure intuition of police officers, and does what it says in the tin. But whether or not it's the only thing we can do, I think there probably are other options. But I think stop and search has a role to play, especially in modern times where, especially with even things like drugs getting more and more prominent in central London now, and concealed knives, I think you have to find a balancing act between law and order and personal freedoms.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely one of the tools that has to be available to officers. And I think the problem we've gotten ourselves into as a country is that more often than not, officers are frightened of using the powers they have. And they're frightened because
They're being blamed.
they're going to be blamed. They're concerned that it's going to end up on Twitter or TikTok. And we saw, of course, in the infamous case a few weeks ago, how things can get into control very quickly and you don't have a full view of what happened on the day. You know, officers were attacked. They responded to that with force, appropriately so in my view. But they were criticised on the day because you only had one snippet of whatever was happening at the time. I think we need to back officers. If we're going to start saying we need more and better officers, and we need to pay them properly, and we need to make sure they know they're going to be backed.
I think one of the points I should have come to a little bit earlier, but I will come to it now, is the young people I'm talking with in the university and the kind of politicians they want running their council, running their constituency, are the politicians that have experienced or have done something outside of politics before. I think it's really important that everybody has something to bring to politics, something to contribute. You both have had a career outside of politics directly. So this is probably what we should have started with. But tell me about how your experience of work outside of politics relates or probably helps and introduce into what you have been doing.
Fair enough. No, it's a good thing to raise. I think there are a lot of career politicians these days, and they do a great job. But I personally think, as I would say myself, that having experience in other sort of industries and fields gives that sort of broader perspective. And I'm a GP, I'm a doctor. I used to work in hospitals, and now I'm in a little semi-attached house that everyone's familiar with a rabbit warren of clinical rooms. And for me, it's given me a great understanding of people's sort of thought processes, how they treat their own health, and interacting with people from all sort of spectrums of society, all walks of life. There are literally thousands of interactions over the years. And it's really shaped my views on, cemented my views in many ways about being on the conservative side of things. And perhaps NHS management and sort of seeing how inefficient government has been over the years and running services into the ground has really sort of made me feel actually that, as our friend Ronald Reagan would say, government is not the answer. And seeing how you do things differently has really sort of helped shape my perspective on things. So I know Paul has a really interesting background as well. So
yeah, I mean, I hesitate before saying I'm a barrister in any political setting nowadays, because it's obvious that we've had a lot of individuals in a senior level who have been at the bar. Although I should stress, Tony Blair, who I still have a great deal of respect for as having been a strong Prime Minister in my view, particularly in his early terms, was an employment rights barrister. Keir Starmer was a human rights barrister. I am a pure commercial barrister, so I deal with disputes both here and in the Middle East relating to any kind of infrastructure you can think of. It could be housing, it could be airports, it could be waste treatment plants, oil and gas plants. So I look at this from a business perspective as well as an advocate, and have quite a good deal of experience working with businesses to get them results, whether here or in the Middle East.
The last point I would like to raise on this podcast today is that I would say London and the UK as a whole is experiencing all sorts of economic problems, and we're hearing all kinds of comparison that some people in some areas of London are poorer than some people in some areas of the other countries, and the way Labour chooses to sort this out and tell me if it's working is by taxing, raising more money via tax. But of course, if it would have been so easy that you would just tax people and get the money and get the economy running, then probably every government would do it. What do you think?
But yeah, I think tax is a fascinating thing, isn't it, really? I mean, it's the one thing that sort of death and taxes and certainties in life. And I think if you look at the Scandinavian models, they have very high taxes, and they also get a lot of public service for that. And that's
just what they're referring to.
Yeah, and that's always the argument, isn't it? So it's like, well, if we tax more, we can all live like Norwegians and have this great public services. But our taxes already are very high, and we're not getting great public services. And for example, trains I was trying to catch yesterday, Waterloo, everything was cancelled. Healthcare waiting lists in Wales, just where we're from, 5 years for hip replacements, for orthopedic surgeries, and you're not getting that value tax. So what are you paying for, essentially? I think that's the difficulty where people struggle to rationalize it. And if you take the different model, which is lower taxation, you encourage people to move to the country. And I do believe in triplenomics. I think if you do have more wealth, lots of wealthy people living in the city, and they spend money, they buy their expensive cars or watches, then people working there goes to the Pret and the shops and spending money in the cafes. It just stimulates employment at all levels. Now, obviously, there's a limit to it, but I believe there is a logic to it and not having those people at all and having them all go to Italy, which I think has carried the biggest benefactor of our wealth taxes. So I think you have to be very careful with it. But if in doubt, lower taxes is always going to be the way, for me, that will stimulate growth, encourage people to move the country, encourage them to invest, and work harder, because you get to keep more of it at the end of the day. So I think that is the way forward for me. But Paul, I'm sure, is
yeah. And I think what's fascinating about our tax system now is that it's become so progressive, actually, our tax system, that we're now at a stage where 60% of our income tax take as a country is coming from 3.6 million people. So when we decided, and I don't necessarily think it's such a bad idea to decide that a large chunk of our income tax is coming from the wealthiest, you also have to be mindful that you need to keep the wealthy in the country, because they're the ones that are really paying in a very big way for public services. And I'm afraid that's not what this government has got right. I think there are many people in the Conservative Party who rightly, including the leadership, think that there were certain things that perhaps got progressively wrong in the last 14 years on things like non-dom taxation. And we will need to look again at how we encourage wealthy people who will be paying tax to come back to the country. Because unless and until we do that, we will see the brain drain and the wealth drain, and we will simply have a progressively worse budget deficit situation.
Well, I think it was an amazing discussion, and I'm certainly going to have a lot more people like in groups. Maybe at some point I will have 3, maybe 4. Maybe I will have to rearrange the sofa or buy a new one. Who knows? But remember that you were the first ones.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great.
So much.
See you.